Okay, so we're gonna make some pizza. And one thing that I've learned is that you're gonna come across baking what's called baker's percentage. And when you think about a percentage, for practical purposes, you think that's the percent of that ingredient to the whole, your whole dough ball. But a baker's percentage is actually a comparison in weight in grams of the ingredients to the weight of the flour. The flour is like the base, 100%. And what you're gonna find is that that's not very good for translating into how much it is of the whole dough. I personally like 67% hydration, so it's 67% in weight in water compared to the 100% weight in the flour. And what you want to do is convert that to each constituent compared to the whole dough ball, so you can find out how much you want. I'm only explaining that in case you do come across baker's percentages and you want to play with that. So 67% water to the 100% flour, divide one by the whole, adding the two, and what you'll get is 67% divided by 167%, both of them, will give you 40% water, which will leave you 60% flour compared to the whole. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna make a 1,000-gram dough ball because I want 4 250-gram dough balls. So if I got 40% water, 67% baker's hydration percentage, it's 40% water of that 1,000. 40% of 1,000 would be 400 grams by weight. And the cool thing about the metric system is that your base units are all 1-to-1 in comparison. So what that means is a gram of water is a milliliter of water is a cubic centimeter of water. So my 400 grams of water will be 400 milliliters of water. So we'll check that out. I'm gonna let that water run a little. I use tap water here. Actually tastes pretty good, the amount on it. So we're gonna test that out if the gram to units of volume translates. We've got our handy dandy scale here. Turn that so I can get it closer. And we're going to go ahead and tear that out. And we are going to add 400 grams of water and see if it is indeed, and the metrics on this side isn't, if it is 400 milliliters. And re-tear that. There we go. Go quickly up till we get close to 400. And you'll see as we approach it. And that's 387. Got 404. And I don't know if you can tell by the angle, but that's like right exactly at the 400. Now another thing I know is that it takes 50 to 55 seconds for my water to get up to the temperature I need it for the yeast, the optimal temperature. So we'll do 53 seconds. And you want your yeast, the water that you're going to place the yeast into, at like 100, 105 degrees. You don't want to go over 110, or what you're going to do is you're going to end up killing the yeast. And so we're going to get that. We got our bowl. And while we're waiting, that baker's percentage, as a percentage, we're going to need salt. Where I got a little doodad here. And get out the really accurate one here for salt. And salt I like, and that's the baker's percentage now, not the percentage of the whole. I like 3%. 3% compared to the flour. And we know the flour is 600 grams, so 3% of 600, well, 10% of 600 would be 60, so 1% would be 6, so 3% would be 18 grams. So we need 18 grams of salt. And I think I have the salt in here. So 18 grams of salt. Get us a little container over here. Just for the purposes. And that's your most important ratio, really, is your salt. How much salt you got in it. Because salt is what gives strength to the gluten structure. Gluten being the proteins in the flour forming long stretchy chains that hold and trap the carbon dioxide produced by the yeast. Too weak, and it's just going to escape and rise unevenly, especially when you bake it. Too much salt, and it's going to be tough. So what did we say? 3%. We needed 18 grams. So we'll turn that on, and that'll tear out automatically. And that is grams. It is on grams. And so tear it again because it's really sensitive. So we need 18 grams of salt. I think I just turned it back off, didn't I? 18 grams of salt. There it is. See how sensitive that is. There. 18 grams of salt. 10% of 600 being 60, 1% being 6 times 3 is 18. There's 10, 11, 12. Thing about pizza dough, it's pretty forgiving too. So let's see. That's 18.6. Here, just watch it be 17 now. 18.2, we'll call that good. So we got that. Put away the cocaine scale here. Actually, that's for herbs and seasonings like that. So we got that. And now we want to test and see if I can break my camera. Now I want to test and see if I'm accurate with that temperature. So I'll get this mandolin out of the way. Get one of these probes. Here's a probe. Put the mandolin back in here. And we're going to get out the thermometer here. And we'll check it out and see how accurate I was if I can get this to sit still. There, that ought to do it. I'm going to get my thermal probe. Put in the probe. I'm going to get out our water. And I said, what, 100 to 110, I believe it was, right? Let's have a look at this here. I'm pretty sure that's the right temperature. Yeah. 100 to 110 there. And let's make sure it's between those two. I got that. And I got that in the frame. And we have us here a stir. So we get an accurate 102, 104. So that's just where we want it. And to proof the yeast, we want to throw in a teaspoon of salt. Turn this off, put it back up. So we've determined we want 600 grams of flour, 400 grams of water. So put away the salt because we're not going to need it anymore. Get a teaspoon of sugar. Grab us a teaspoon. And you can do that by weight too if you really want to. But throw in a teaspoon of sugar here. And I like to let the yeast proof without the salt so that it doesn't inhibit the yeast. So there's a teaspoon of sugar. And get her. And once you open these, you want to refrigerate them. They can sit on the shelf as long as they're sealed. So what is it? 2 1/4. Yeah, I think it is for a packet. 2 1/4 it says there. So 2 1/4 teaspoons. And 1, 2. Call that 1/4. And 1/4. And we'll let that sit for like 10 minutes. Now, if this was one of my sourdough cultures, and anything that's not just plain yeast is considered sourdough, not just your classically understood San Francisco sourdough. If it was one of those that has lactobacilli in it for flavor, after I make the dough, I'd throw it in the fridge for 2 or 3 days so the bacteria could produce its wonderful flavor while holding the yeast in check, or stasis. But since it's just yeast, we're going to go ahead and make this as soon as it's ready. So I'm going to give this about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and continue. So, I mean, if you're not playing around with baker's percentages online and you want to just go by my percentages of the whole, what you want is roughly 60% flour, 40% water. And we'll be back in about 10 minutes and see how that looks. So it's been about 10 minutes. You can see that's foamed up really nicely. The other thing we need while I'm in here is our 600 grams of flour. So let's get that real quick. Get that. Turn it on. You can tear it out after you turn it on, because that's a 213 gram stainless steel bowl. And we need our 600 grams of flour. And so now you can sift this if you want. It's really not that necessary. 600, 2, 3, 4, 50, 540, 575, 586. You know what, we'll go a little bit over. So I'm going to need some extra, because what you'll find out is once you start making dough, those percentages, all of those percentages, you just need the rough estimate, because you're going to go by feel eventually, because you want it tacky to the touch, and that'll be apparent. So we got 622, but that's fine. So we got that. I'll move back over to the bench where I got some room. Pause this. Okay, so we got everything we need here, and a cat underfoot. And there isn't even really a lot of netting to this. We're going to do what's called autolysis, which means you let it do its own thing. You let the enzymes in the flour develop the dough. And you can see that's really nice and foamed up. Throw that in there. Make sure we get everything there. Swish it around. So we got everything we need there. And I actually like adding the dry to the wet. So the first thing we'll do is add about half of it. Mix that up. It's really rather simple. You just do this a few times, letting it sit in between. That way it gets nice and hydrated. All the water gets absorbed by the flour. Those are your only ingredients: flour, water, salt, and yeast. And like I said, since it's not a sourdough culture, one that has the bacteria, once the dough's ready, we don't need to let it sit in the fridge to develop the flavor of whatever variety of lactobacillus you're using. And get that, and get a little more. By the way, that's where towards the end this will come in. That'll condition the dough, a couple teaspoons of that. And what that does is it makes it easier to stretch your dough. You don't really need it once you get experience. What I'm saying is you'll get a feel for this, because you want your dough. The cat's having a trip with that box. You want your dough to be more wet than dry if you're going to go one way or the other. It's more forgiving. That way it doesn't dry out in the oven. And the lower temperature you're cooking at, the more wet you want your dough. Higher temperatures, it bakes faster, especially if it's like Neapolitan. You've got a couple minutes, 90 seconds, and it's done. But here, with a conventional oven, you're only going to get up to like 550, 600 degrees, so you want your dough wetter than if you were making a Neapolitan in 90 seconds. What you're going to see is this right here. I'm going to let this sit for about 5 minutes so that it evenly hydrates, and then be back and get a plate to put on that. come back in about 10 minutes and continue. Okay, so it's been about 10 minutes and the dough should look considerably wetter since it's had time to absorb the water. And as you can see, it is. And what we're going to do is add most of the rest of the flour and let it sit for about another 10 minutes. And then it'll be closer to letting it sit for about an hour so that it'll be ready to use. Now you can see that's wet. I'm going to go ahead and see how much flour I got. I put about half in. I'm going to put about a remaining half of this half or a quarter in. So we'll put about that much in. And see, I'm not netting this dough. I'm just mixing it so that it, like I said, it lets the enzymes in there work on it, converting the proteins in the flour into gluten and breaking down some of the constituents into sugars for the yeast. You can see how it's starting to pull away already. Definitely getting thick here. You can see. You know what? It's a lot more fun to cook when you look at it as like play and an experiment. Even if it doesn't turn out the way you want, it's not a big deal. It just gives you a better idea of what to do next time. It's just flour and water. You can see that's absorbed that pretty well. And I'll let that sit for about 10 minutes. And you, of course, occupy your time doing whatever you want in between. So we got that. Add a little more so it pulls away a little more. See, beginning to pull away there nicely into a dough ball. And I'll show you the consistency here. So that's pulled away nicely. This will again be wetter once I come back to it. So we'll let that sit and come back in about 10 more minutes. So about 5 after. Okay, you can see it's been about 10 or 15 minutes. That's not a real strict time control. You can see it's puffed up and it's wet. For clarification purposes, I removed that 22 grams that was over the measured amount for the recipe. And this is how much is actually left now. So we put a half, then we put a half as a quarter, a half of a half of a half of that would be about an eighth. So we're gonna put about an eighth in there. And we'll call that good right there. And I might use that as a bench flour. It just depends on how humid it is, your oven, your altitude. Like I said, the thing you want to go by is you want the dough to like be sticky, but not so sticky it gloms in pieces, just tacky. So work the flour in here. And you can see it's stiffening up. Towards the end, it takes longer to get the rest of the flour in there. I mean, you can pull it apart and get the wet insides onto it. you an idea of the consistency there. That's what I got left in with it. I'm gonna get all that in there, and the remaining water will pull it in and get it covered in there. That's pretty close to about the consistency you want right there. You see how sticky that is? We're just gonna turn this around some, and then we're gonna let it sit a little longer. And at this point, after I let it sit, when I come back, I'm gonna throw in a couple tablespoons of olive oil. That helps make the dough easier to spread, but you can see how it's really, really sticky. It'll be even wetter when I come back. That's why generally I don't do that. See how wet that still is? I'm gonna put the last little bit of that in there, and then we'll let it proof for a few hours. So there's that. Come back in another 10 minutes. All right, so it should be wetter, more full in volume, and it is. You can see bubbles now. And so we're gonna add the olive oil now. You can see it does pull away nicely. Add a couple teaspoons of olive oil. And you don't have to do this either. But it does make handling the dough easier. But at lower temperatures, it also helps it too. You can see how it's just going to pull away the rest of the way there. I want to incorporate that into there. That. I'm going to add just a little bit of the flour to it so it can become a dough ball proper. That's how much I got left after taking out that extra 22. So go ahead, do that. And that should be about right. And the one thing I need to do is work it. You can see how now what I mean by it's sticky, but I mean even without dusting my hands with flour, it's not so sticky that any of it's peeling away and leaving on my fingers too much. So we got that. Could add a little bit more flour to that, and that's what we're gonna do. Just enough, so that I can work it. What I'm actually going to do is just a little more in there so I can work it without it being too sticky. You can see I got most all of it in there in 4 runs. And there it goes. It doesn't take much. If your dough is too sticky, add like a teaspoon of flour at a time, very little amount, until it starts becoming smooth like that. And conversely, if it's too dry, add like a half a teaspoon of water. A little bit more. You can see about how much flour I have left. Like I said, it's by hand at this point. That'll end up coming in. When I'm about done with it. And you see I'm just turning it in on itself there. And the more you work it, the tighter that gluten will be, and it'll start tearing instead of stretching. But we're gonna let that rise one time. You can let it rise 4 or 5 times doing what I'm about to do right now. So what we'll do, put a little bit of olive oil in here. Not too much. And oil up the bowl. And oil up the bowl. Let little buddy sit there and develop for about, you can let it set for 10 minutes, you can let it set for an hour, 2 hours in between. But you let it develop, and then that autolysis is going on where enzymes are breaking down the proteins and you're getting your sugars, and the proteins are forming into gluten. Your gluten's relaxing, the salt's working on it and mediating the whole thing along with the oil. A whole bunch of stuff going on. All things are good with time though. Well, most things. So we're gonna let that sit for 20 minutes. Okay. So it should be a lot smoother coming out here now when I put a little bit of flour on it. You can see it's risen considerably in 20 minutes or whatever it's been. So, get some of this bench flour. Throw a little on there if you want. It's going to do the same thing. You see what it looks like? Pull away pretty easily since I oiled it especially. And there you have it. And throw that down. Straight edge it out. Fold it over on itself. You can feel the air in that, and you see how it's sticky? That's what you want, and I don't even have any on my hands. And if you really want to be picky about your dough not drying out, you could use that olive oil, or you learn a light touch and you don't need it, instead of the flour. Look how stretchy that is. You see that? And watch this. I throw a little bit of flour on here. Watch how smooth this gets. That's another sign. Look, you can even hear it. Listen to that. And you can see, just let it fall on itself. You can even see how it's beginning to smooth. You can see the chains of gluten in there. And so what I'm going to do with this, see I've hardly worked it. Look at them bubbles coming up. Nicely, evenly hydrated. Just a couple sprinkles of flour. You can see what I'm doing there. I'm just doing that alternately. You can just leave it on here and do this. Accomplish the same thing. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back in the bowl with a light sprinkling on it. And back into the bowl it goes. Good dog. Good times. Okay, that maps out. It's gonna be really, really smooth. You can see it's risen some more. Is that in frame? Yeah, that's good. there it is. You can see the network on that right there. And just look at that. See how it's building up in there really nicely. And look how you can see it's still tacky. And look at that network in there. See that gluten's developed and relaxed. I'm gonna bring this over to it, get a little closer and show you. With a little dusting there. It's really smooth. And we can zoom in, I think, on this. Watch this. Really zoom in. You can see how smooth that network is. Look at it stretch. And you could use this dough right now. But I like doing this a few more times to let it really develop a nice structure, especially since I'm making New York style thinner pizzas. So there you have that again. And you didn't even have to work the dough, knit it, do all that work. See all the layers it has. And just put that back in there. And you can see it's still sticky on the inside. Press it down. And you see how the gluten's tightened up a little. When you are ready to make a pizza, you want to let it rest before you try stretching it out. Anyways, that's it. You just break it up and make a pizza. Let it rise and make a pizza. Or do what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna put one in the fridge for later, and I'm gonna freeze 3 of them. Okay. Let's see how much flour I ended up with extra. There's that, and I think I put like